Here's to second chances. A man's taste can change with the years, his perspective can change with the seasons, and his mood with the hours. Sometimes your first impression is unfair. I bounced off Baldur's Gate, the original one from the 90s, the first time I tried to play it. I found it fiddly, clunky, and corny, despite already being a PC gamer who knew and loved advanced Dungeons and Dragons and all of its nonsense like THACO and exceptional strength scores. For some reason, I had to play and love the less appreciated Icewind Dale first, before I could come back to Baldur's Gate, see it with fresh eyes, and really appreciate it. Same thing happened to me with Devil May Cry, where I bounced off both 1 and 3, and then years later, after loving both God Hand and Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, I returned to Devil May Cry 3 and found it delightful. Or take Final Fantasy XIII. When I first played it in 2010, I thought the hallway simulator accusations were fair, and I was irritated by the characters and script. When the Xbox One got an enhanced backwards compatible version of the game in 2018, I revisited it, and with eyes unclouded, I saw that, you know what, actually, I think my original reaction was correct. It really is that linear, and the characters and script really are that irritating. I did discover a deeper appreciation for the music and the background lore, but mostly remain an unrepentant hater. And I still think it's the worst of the 3D Final Fantasies. In other words, second chances are just that chances, not guarantees. It's not always worth a second look. Star Fox Zero ended up being one of my more pleasant surprises of the year so far. And the Wii U's library, while relatively small and unsung, does have more than its fair share of great games, like Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, Super Mario 3D World, and Breath of the Wild. So I've been feeling pretty bullish on the system and its legacy in general, and that makes me want to take another look at Wii U games that I previously wrote off. I did play a little bit of the Wonderful 101's introductory stage back when it launched, and haven't touched it or thought about it much since then. But given that I'm feeling really positive on the Wii U, and I've had a lot more positive experience with what they call character action games since then, I think it's worth another shot. What is this game's problem? Okay, there's a lot to like here. I admire Platinum for framing a character action game this way, zoomed out to space, with fixed camera angles and hundreds of tiny dudes. And despite most of the actual jokes it makes not landing at all for me, the energy propelling those jokes is infectious. Importantly, I hope it's been clear throughout this video series that these are not reviews, that I'm not claiming objectivity or passing judgment on Wonderful 101 per se. I'm trying to understand what I can get out of the game. And the answer is, not much for me for two main reasons. Number one, this thing. A lot of Wonderful 101's controls feel comfortably standard. You move with the analog stick, one shoulder button dodges, another shoulder button blocks, you have face buttons for attack and jump. This is not particularly alien. My favorite of the Clover and Platinum luminaries based on their gamographies is undoubtedly Shinji Mikami, who directed Resident Evil 4, God Hand, and Vanquish. But if I were to instead judge based on Twitter etiquette, I've always had a soft spot for Hideki Kamiya, who, when not calling people insects online, sometimes directs games like Devil May Cry, Beautiful Joe, and Okami. Beautiful Joe has some clear tokusatsu aesthetic influences on Wonderful 101, and I have no problem with that. But Okami had this awkward pace killing brush mechanic that expected the player to trace shapes on the screen with the analog stick in lieu of equipping and activating items like in a traditional Zelda game. I understand the gimmick's connection to the game's painterly aesthetic, and I understand the conceptual advantage that this provides, removing unnecessary menuing and allowing the player to access more moves than there are buttons on the controller. But god damn, tracing shapes with an analog stick really sucks. And Wonderful 101 takes this worst part of Okami and makes it the centerpiece of its real time action combat. It is so unpleasant. I'm sitting in a cushy chair, holding a controller, playing a video game. I should be the comfiest guy alive. But drawing circles and squiggles with the analog stick is taking me out of it. I'm not comfy, nor am I in a flow state. It's a profane third thing, like when you're pressing on an ATM touchscreen and the system isn't responding, and you're not sure what about the way you touched it was wrong. Or when you're saying, speak to an operator in an outside voice, and the robot responding to you says, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. I don't know what the proper word for this is, but it's awful. And after hours with Wonderful 101, for me, it's still awful. Console games have been struggling with this problem for ages of having too many tools and not enough buttons. And different games have had different unsatisfying workarounds, from constant menuing in Zelda games to wheels upon wheels in Baldur's Gate 3. I think the only response to this problem that ever truly feels good rather than compromised is button chords, fighting game style inputs, things that pack meaning into combinations of button presses. That is way more fluid and reliable than making little drawings with an analog stick. And as analog stick squiggles also require practice to get good at, they just feel worse and are less reliable, I really don't get the appeal. Those of you who have watched my Next Machina video may be thinking right about now, is this guy really going to be defeated by an analog stick again? And yeah, I guess so. Unfortunately so. As I said earlier, there are actually two things keeping me from loving the game. The other is pretty straightforward. The game is constantly interrupting itself with short cutscenes or long cutscenes or unfailable but distracting tasks breaking up the actual gameplay. Draw a ladder, draw a chain, draw a paper airplane, turn a crank. I think of character action games as being relatively dense and focused as a rule, not as dense as most arcade based genres, but denser than games that prize cinematic prestige and measure their worth by their mocap and voice acting budgets. But there is so much goofy, one off, trivial stuff punctuating the game's combat. So we have analog stick novelty breaking up the game's combat encounters, and quasi minigame distractions preventing one combat encounter from flowing into the next. Dozens of flies hovering around my food, ruining my picnic. In such conditions, I would rather just stay home. The way I've seen people talk about Wonderful 101 brings to mind the diamond mining meme. I don't mean that sarcastically or dismissively. I mean, I've seen people talk about the game's weaknesses, suffering through an initial playthrough or two, and eventually discovering an all time favorite. I believe them. I believe there's gold buried there, and that enough time with Wonderful 101 reduces the frustration of the analog stick inputs enough and allows the player's focus to sleepwalk unaware through the boring minigame ish trifles and only truly see and remember the more engaging encounters. And on those terms, I believe that the people who say this game is an all time great are being sincere. Persistence can sometimes let a player take a flawed game and find the diamond inside. But not this game, and not for me. I don't have it in me. The good news is that there are plenty of, quote, character action games that I have gotten a lot out of, like Devil May Cry 3, and God Hand, and Ninja Gaiden Black, and the Greek God of War games, and Metal Gear Rising. And trying and failing to appreciate Wonderful 101 doesn't really change that. Ninja Gaiden 2, Zone of Ender's Second Runner, PS2 Shinobi all remain on my backlog. Up next, maybe the biggest gamble on the entire bingo board. Street Fighter 6. I am just not a PvP guy and haven't been since playing Street Fighter 2 and Children of the Atom back in the 90s. I don't have a strong competitive streak, but I've continued to find clips of more recent fighting games, especially of the Street Fighter series, engaging, readable, and exciting. And my hands have never forgotten how to do a dragon punch. So, after decades spent going home to be a family man, it's time to get back in the saddle.